All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is David. I'm going to be providing sort of a survey of disadvantages on the Arctic topic. So we'll start with a brief outline of the lecture. So I've categorized a lot of the DAs that I'm going to be talking about by domestic and international. So we're going to talk about each category. Obviously, that's not a clear and hard line to draw because domestic DAs have international implications and vice versa, but I think it's a useful way of viewing both AFs and how you're going to be writing links to different affirmatives, as well as viewing the impact area and the types of research that you're going to be doing when you're trying to write disadvantages on the topic. So that's the taxonomy that I have chosen to go with. And then I'm going to provide some tips and tricks on how you can research and write new disadvantages on the topic. But first, before we do any of that, I want to start with a measured plea. Please write disadvantages and go for disadvantages. A couple of reasons that I think that this is an important skill to develop and learn, and something that will result in you winning a lot more debates. First, your judges hate counterplan competition debates. Think about you sitting through that lecture for all of yesterday morning and how unhappy you must have been by the end of it and how much your brain hurt. Now imagine that that is happening at 1,000,000 miles an hour and kids are just reading blocks at one another and not answering each other's arguments. That is what it is like to judge a counterplan competition debate. I would know. I judge a lot of them. It is an unfortunate circumstance that we have found ourselves in, and going for a disadvantage will make your judges love you. Going for disadvantages reduces judge variance. No longer do you have to look at paradigms to figure out if your judge likes other issues before the debate, to figure out what your 2AR has to be. It's the first thing that everybody learns when they're going into policy debates. So you can kind of take whatever judge you want and assume that if your DA isn't that complicated, they can probably follow it. Your judges like case debating. If you're just fiating the plan every debate, you're never going to have to debate the case. It's connected to the fact that a lot of you know most AFs have a lot of problems. People are bad at cutting cards, their impact scenarios are usually made up, but you can't exploit any of these things unless you go for the status quo and you have the option of debating the case in the 2&R. So being able to effectively write and deploy good disadvantages against a variety of affirmative positions is an important way that you can then leverage the weakness of affirmative cases to your advantage. I could write an AF with a fantastic US key warrant with all of the stuff that Raleigh just said, but if my impacts are terrible, I'm not going to be able to beat it if somebody just goes for the status quo. There is no negative resolution. You don't want to be abusing the affirmative by trying to fiat in a bunch of stuff. That's very hurtful. And the fiat case for losers. No one wants that. Let's go for Disads instead. All right. With that reasoned plea out of the way, let's talk about some domestic disadvantages on the Arctic topic. The first one, and probably the best disad against a lot of particularly smaller AFs, is the environment. Not disad, but like class of disads. There are a lot of different routes that the environment can go in terms of different affirmatives, what they may do, how they interact with the Arctic. So put simply, the environment disad says the plan is bad for the environment. It's fairly self-explanatory. I think that this is best against oil, gas, and mineral extraction AFs. So, AFs that have to, dig for something, they have to find resources, they have to pull them out of the earth, they do something that disrupts the natural environment of the Arctic in a way that could be damaging for the environment. There are a lot of different ways that affirmatives can interact with the environment. So there are a variety of impact areas, whether that is biodiversity, affirmatives impacting marine and wildlife, impacting the ability of plants to grow. If you're, digging into the environment and spewing up a bunch of soil all over the place, then it's hard to then grow things in the same places where we've extracted a bunch of minerals. There could be nuclear radiation and waste. So when you build a power plant in the Arctic, the spare nuclear material has to go somewhere, and that often has implications for clean water, has implications for the ecosystems surrounding those waste facilities. And in order to put a nuclear power plant in the Arctic, you have to first build it. It requires using a lot of construction materials, driving a lot of trucks, building new roads potentially. A lot of AFs have to fiat building new roads and bridges, all of which would disrupt the natural environment in the Arctic. We've talked a lot about permafrost thaw, the implications that has for access to minerals, the implications that that has for shipping. This is something that AFs are almost certain to impact. There could be oil spills, so there are a lot of proposals for oil and gas leasing that would allow private companies to drill in the Arctic, particularly in like the big federal wildlife refuge. The federal government in the OBBB just unlocked a bunch of new federal land that it can then auction leases off to private companies for oil and gas drilling and extraction. That is a potential and significant controversial area where development and exploitation of Arctic resources will potentially result in catastrophic environmental effects. There's also noise pollution. So even something as simple as sailing a ship through the Arctic can have significant impact on the ability of animals reproducing. So, when we use sonar in the Arctic, for example, in the case of like the domain awareness AF, to locate other ships and submarines under the water, that sonar interferes with the ability of whales to navigate and find one another. Whales are the biggest mammals on Earth and some of the most important in terms of ecosystem functioning in the context of both the Arctic and the oceans generally. A lot of whales go to the Arctic to migrate. And so if we're inhibiting their ability to navigate and reproduce, that has significant implications not just for Arctic ecosystems, but for ecosystems across the globe. You're going to have a whole environment lecture tomorrow that will sort of reveal this further for you. It's important to note, this is the primary objection to many, especially localized Arctic development and in exploration projects. So when you're AF and you're thinking about either turning the environment DA or writing answers to it, the vast majority of proposals, particularly in the context of minerals, oil, and gas, have to consider their environmental impacts in order to be persuasive to a larger audience. So most affirmatives are going to be able to find specific reasons why their particular form of extraction, of mining, of drilling is not as environmentally damaging as maybe it has been historically. So the key to writing an effective environment DA against the vast majority of affirmatives on the topic is to be able to explain why, secondary thoughts from the oil and gas industry are not going to be enough in order to prevent the environmental impact that the AF may have in the context of the Arctic. So that is the environment DA. This is going to be the general format for how the lecture is going to proceed, where we'll talk about impact areas, AF that it applies to, and why the AF may be right or wrong. That's the environment DA. The next DA, this is a big one and one that we haven't really explored at the camp so far. Resource trade-off. As the topic lecture and the other lectures have taught you, there are a lot of agencies with overlapping mandates in the Arctic. There are a lot of different actors involved in any oil and gas project. So, the thesis of the resource trade-off DA is that the plan costs valuable resources. Those resources have to come from somewhere. Most AFs have to spend money from somewhere. They have to, use ships, trucks, they have to buy resources for construction, and those resources have to come from somewhere. Agencies do not just have free rein, a blank check to be able to spend on whatever expensive infrastructure development projects that they want to. That has to come from somewhere, and agencies have to make choices about where they are placing their focus. Think about this in the context of like the icebreakers affirmative. We only have so many icebreakers. There are only so many missions that we can do in a year given the capacity constraints that the Coast Guard has and where its icebreakers are at a particular time. It could be that if an affirmative increases icebreaker operations in the Arctic, those operations come at the expense of having those ships somewhere else. You can't be in the same place twice. That is a perfect example of how the trade-off DA can become persuasive against one of the biggest AFs on the topic. Usually, these DAs are tied to specific US or sometimes international agencies responsible for enforcing the plan. So I just used the Coast Guard example. There are other agencies that I'll show a non-comprehensive list in a second, all of which could have implications. The way that you go about writing these DAs is finding commonalities among the affirmatives that you're going to be debating. So if you know that a lot of people at whatever tournament you're going to are reading Coast Guard AFs, that is a reason to write your Coast Guard trade-off DA. If you're debating a bunch of AFs about, the Arctic survey, if there are a lot of people that have to do geological surveys, that is a reason to write it about the US Geological Survey. The most important AF argument that you need to think about when writing the resource trade-off DA is fiat solves the link. The AF will argue that fiat ensures the plan's funding is guaranteed. It could be through statute, it could be through a magic wand, and that does not trade off with other priorities in the Arctic, because trade-offs do not question whether the plan is desirable, but whether it is feasible, which is beyond the scope of the resolution and the question that the AF must answer. So if you are negative and you are writing a trade-off DA, you need to have a compelling explanation for why the affirmative has to pull resources from somewhere else and why it can't pull them out of thin air. Whether that is because it is real world, because the topic literature suggests that those trade-offs are real and it's an important discussion, or whether it's because the negative needs trade-off DAs to have generics against a wide set of affirmatives. There are a number of ways that you can articulate why the DA is good, but it requires a little bit of legwork on the part of the negative, because the AF answer to some people is fairly intuitive. Now, this is some of the many agencies that have significant overlap in the context of a lot of affirmatives. And so I encourage you to investigate these different agency mandates. A lot of them are contained within statute. Other ones are contained within their own executive memoranda, but they all will have some implication for a lot of AFs. Whether it is, just within the Department of Energy, you can see 3 different offices that all have implications for AFs that have already been released on the topic. This doesn't even include the other parts of the military. So for example, the Security Cooperation AF would have to do with military exercises, maybe the Air Force, but also certainly the Department of State, who themselves have constrained resources. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to the international DAs, but again, non-comprehensive list. There are lots of moving parts of the government, all of which want more money and don't have it, and all of which could be significantly impacted by large proposals that are forwarded by the affirmative on this topic. All right, that's the resource trade-off DA. The economy DA, or economy categories of DAs. These argue that the plan negatively impacts the economy or a particular sector of the economy. And when I'm referring to the economy, I'm referring not only to US domestic industries, but to international industries as well. So these DAs are mostly useful in the context of AFs that do things like funding renewable projects, because those have cross-sectoral implications, or claim advantages from widespread rollout of green energy. They can also be useful against AFs that, for example, impact our ability to ship in the Arctic. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. So here are some common areas of the economy that some of the AFs at camp so far perhaps impact. So first is oil. There are AFs that have been read on the topic so far that do things like develop nuclear energy and read advantages about the implications that has on our ability to combat climate change. And that green transition has significant implications for global oil prices. It would lower oil prices because decreased demand causes a corresponding decrease in prices, so that oil companies will try to compete and outcompete with the renewables that the plan builds. There's also implications that this would have for liquefied natural gas, which is something that we can drill for in the Arctic, and that would be offset by renewables because it is considered a bridge fuel, so a bridge between fossil fuels and green renewables. Increasing our domestic renewable supply would decrease our export of liquefied natural gas. This would cause other suppliers to sell to our friends, for example, Russia, and that would be bad. This is a significant controversy among renewables people because our ability to domestically export natural gas is important for a lot of local economies and is also important in the race to compete with Russia. There's also electricity prices. This one is probably better against more localized affirmatives. So think you're like native climate adaptation, building green renewables for indigenous people. Integrating lots of renewables into grids very quickly could raise electricity prices as those renewables struggle to come online. This has significant implications for the ability of communities to pay for their own electricity. So if you're debating a soft left AF, you can beat them on their own game by going for the AF is too expensive for the people that it is trying to help. This also has significant implications for, the ability of our grid to sustain itself. If people aren't able to pay for electricity, that funding cannot go into continuing to modernizing the grid. So AF solvency could be significantly impacted if there is not a significant tax base that is able to pay for the AF. There's also the trade DA. There is the idea that expanding Arctic maritime shipping can trade off with other regional shipping routes. So for example, the Panama Canal or the Suez Canal, that may be important for other regional economies. Though there is very good affirmative evidence, as Raleigh showed earlier, that this may not be true, there's also very good evidence that suggests that it might be. And it is a significant concern, particularly among people in the countries where they make significant amounts of their economic output based on shipping routes, such as Panama. So these are just some of the common areas of the economy that can be impacted by development and exploration of the Arctic. This doesn't even take into consideration the implications that increased access to rare earth minerals would have on our trading relationships with other nations. So you could even say we get a bunch of minerals, we no longer trade with China. That has significant impact on their own economy. The economy DA is never just confined to the United States. It can be globalized, but these are just some of the many avenues that you can take when exploring disadvantages against particular affirmatives. So, the AF will often say, they will try to straight turn the DA, is pretty much the AF approach to a lot of economy DAs, particularly those renewables DAs that I was talking about. They will say that some amount of change in the area of the DA is inevitable. So, if you're reading like the oil DA, the AF will say, we are going to transition to renewables inevitably. They will say that accelerating that transition is better because of its advantages, but delaying it is worse. They will say the case outweighs, but that the DA is inevitable anyway. The AF will also say, in the case of a lot of the smaller sort of infrastructure development, maybe AFs that only exist within Alaska, that the AF is not big enough to significantly impact national economies. This argument leads to an important feature of many of the disadvantages on the Arctic topic. A lot of people I've heard so far have voiced concerns about disadvantage ground. AFs are very small. They do things like we saw in the demo debate where they just, build a bridge, build a road. That might be true, but AFs claim big advantages from small proposals. So your way of guaranteeing links is commonalities among advantage ground, even among those smaller affirmatives. Soft left AFs are out of vogue. People are claiming big advantages for US-Russia relations, for renewables, for these big areas of the economy and of international relations, all of which have significant implications beyond just the mandate of the plan. So the bigger the AF advantage, the more of a link to your disadvantage you are guaranteed, regardless of how the 2AC tries to gaslight you about how the AF is this tiny little proposal that claimed that it solves all of US-Russia relations. So writing links to categories of advantages is your way on the negative to combat the affirmative's monopoly on the size of the AF proposal, particularly what we have seen at camp so far, because a lot of advantage overlap has guaranteed a lot of disadvantages. All right, so we've covered two pretty good DAs, so let's cover a bad one next, the court clog DA. Believe it or not, this DA says that the plan clogs the courts. It causes a lot of litigation, and that litigation would impede the court's ability to process cases quickly and efficiently. So this is best against development AFs with the potential to have environmental implications. There are environmental organizations, lobbying organizations like the Sierra Club, the National Resources Defense Council. The people that are writing policy briefs, negative arguments against those drilling and gas affirmatives are the same people that are challenging every single oil and gas lead in federal court the minute that it is issued by the federal government. They have pre-written briefs and staffed lawyers dedicated to trying to stop extraction and resource exploitation. The link to this DA is not the problem with this DA. The link is incredibly strong. Most federal mineral resource projects, oil and gas projects that would occur in the Arctic will get sued in court. They will be held up. There will be injunctions. Those cases will be battled tooth and nail because companies want money. And they have very, very good lawyers dedicated just to dealing with those lawsuits. This is, for all intents and purposes, a literature-based primary objection to many affirmatives on this topic. It is something you will see mentioned in a lot of sort of overview-based articles about development proposals in the Arctic, because they will say that they have the potential to cause a significant amount of litigation. So again, the problem with this DA is never the link. You are going to find a lot of links when you are doing negative research about the court clog DA and about the various AFs on this topic. The problem is that every other part of this DA kind of sucks. It's never unique. It is never unique. If you are affirmative, you should just be searching for the words court clog or litigation. You will often find that every time the Supreme Court, every June, when we have a bunch of Supreme Court cases come down, there are going to be articles written that say that those court cases that happened in June are going to have reverberative effects across the courts for years to come, because people sue over new case law all the time. Our courts have been overburdened since COVID, but even before COVID. Every year, the federal courts write a review that suggests where they need more resources, where they are understaffed, where they are lacking in personnel, where their calendars are full. That will be reported on year to year. People will review that over the course of the year and see how the courts are doing based on that U.S. courts review that is written every year. The uniqueness evidence that suggests that the courts are not clogged is lies and deceit. It is fake news. It is evidence that suggests that there is hot new technology that in 5 years, maybe eventually, will help the courts a little bit. That card everyone read on the IP topic, that was like, they can do things like Zoom, and like, you know, they can host court online or like delay things. That is a response to a phenomenon that the DA needs to suggest does not exist yet. The fact that they are adopting efficiency measures in the status quo is a reason why they need more efficiency, because the court is already clogged. That card is the negative self-reporting that the court has been clogged. It might not be clogged in the future, but insofar as efficiency measures are needed, that's the negative telling you court's already clogged. Problem might be getting better, but it's still a problem, at least in the context of their internal links. Most impacts to the court clog DA are incredibly contrived. They will talk about things like intellectual property and IPR, which, as we all know from the last topic, when the AF reads that impact about, or the neg reads that impact about patent rights, those are all federal circuit. Those are not other circuits the vast majority of the time. Patent process is generally pretty siloed from the courts that are going to be hearing all of these environmental cases. There are things about like water wars in India. What? Like that intuitively does not make any sense. What does US courts have to do with that? There are things about like judicial exchanges and like sending our judges to other countries to do like talks and stuff. Again, why does court clog impact that? Judges aren't going on vacation, or maybe they are. This doesn't really seem to be impacted by court efficiency, and soft power is not an impact. So generally these impact stories are bad, and the affirmative is going to be best suited not answering the link. Now, you can say the link turns the case. That's a pretty good argument for court clog. You can say that courts holding up the plan delay the plan significantly. You can say that it signals to potential contractors, companies that would bid on an oil and gas lease. You can suggest that those companies may be deterred by the prospect that they too could be liable in a court, that the signal of litigation is enough in order to stop those companies from wanting to risk oil and gas drilling. I mean, as we learned, like the last time the federal government tried to auction off oil and gas leases in January, no one bid. because companies were afraid of the legal and reputational costs associated with drilling in the Arctic. That is certainly still true for the vast majority of affirmatives on this topic. That bidding process that contractors have to go through in order to successfully lease Arctic land or Alaskan land, whatever, still requires a ton of litigation and still has impacts on the willingness of private actors to interact with the affirmative in a way that's necessary for many of them to solve their advantages. So even if what I said is true and the most persuasive AF answers pretty much zero the DA without even talking about the link, that does not mean you shouldn't be cutting link cards for the court clog DA as solvency arguments that can then be made in the negative block when you're kicking the DA with the strategic concession that force the 1AR to have to actually answer the most persuasive component of the DA. Because otherwise, you're just wasting time reading the court clog DA if you're not getting any mileage out of the only part of the court clog DA that makes any sense. So that's the domestic section of general DAs to the Arctic topic. Does anybody have any questions about the domestic section before we move on to some of the international DAs? All right. Let's talk about some international DAs. We've seen so far at camp that a lot of AFs are reading relations advantages. They are cooperating with Arctic Council countries, the Arctic Coast Guard Forum. Various countries are necessary. The Arctic is not really a place where national borders can define what states do. And we know that the race to minerals is causing other countries to focus on the Arctic more so now than they ever have before. So I think international DAs, to the extent that most proposals about the Arctic are about things like minerals, things that nations are competing with one another over, to the extent that that's true, international DAs are going to be your best bet against both the affirmatives that have been put out by the camp so far and new affirmatives that are going to come up over the course of the year. So I think having a strong set of international DAs is more important than the domestic DAs. We're going to start with kind of a stinker. The diplomatic capital DA. This DA suggests that the United States has limited diplomatic capital to address international issues. Diplomatic capital comes in many forms. It could include time. There's only so much we can do in a day. We can't both negotiate over the Arctic and somewhere else at the same time. Resources. The State Department has only so many people it can put places. It has only so much funding that it can dedicate towards paying for diplomats to fly all around the world and deal with international problems, to appear in front of international organizations, to try to rally states around the United States. Political will. States, and the United States in particular, have limited diplomatic bargaining power, and they have to make choices about where to use that. This is similar to the political capital thesis of the politics DA that we learned about earlier, and that I'm not talking about in this lecture because you already got a lecture on it. That the United States has limited bargaining power and limited credibility that it can only use in certain contexts and at certain times. The plan consumes all of those things. It, for example, requires us to continually cooperate with other countries. For these AFs that read spillover advantages that say not only does the AF do a one-time piece of cooperation with the Arctic Coast Guard Forum, but it then results in additional exercises, the graduated steps over time where we continue to cooperate over and over and over again with increasing amounts of countries. Those types of advantages get you a link to the diplomatic capital DA, even if the plan alone does not, because the affirmative will likely require constant maintenance of US relations with other countries in order to continue to solve all of its advantages now and in the future. Diplomacy is not a one-time event, but something that has to be invested in over time and constantly in order for good faith implementation of the plan, so durably fiated implementation of the plan to occur. So, to the extent that you cannot get a link to just the plan alone, you can get a link to plan implementation, because if the federal government is going to implement the plan in good faith, it's got to continue to tell our allies to reassure them. It's got to continue to work with other countries to reassure them, and that requires time, resources, and political will. We also have to justify a lot of this stuff to our allies. So, if we're going to suddenly decide that we want to work with Russia again in the middle of a land war in Ukraine, where they are doing a lot of bad stuff and countries don't really want to risk working with them and the international repercussions of doing so, they're going to demand that we have a pretty good explanation for why we're doing that. We're going to have to put a lot of time and effort not only into those simple discussions and consultations with our allies, but providing them with reassurances in the forms of increased military exercises, in the form of maybe rotational troop presence, things that have to be negotiated between states that allies will demand from the United States as a consequence of the plan, that will require a significant amount of State Department time and resources in order to accomplish. And so the process of reassuring allies over the plan is itself a link to the diplomatic capital DA. It also requires negotiations to bring others on board. Think about the Coast Guard AF, an AF that simply says we should work with Russia and then try to bring other people on board. That process of bringing other people on board requires a lot more resources than just the plan alone and gives you plenty of room for a link. This is best against AFs that cooperate with our adversaries. As you can tell from my description of those different avenues for link arguments, the most diplomatically costly affirmatives are the ones that do something that isn't being done in the status quo for a pretty good reason. And so overcoming a strong inherency argument for why the United States is not cooperating also means that the affirmative has to consume a lot of diplomatic capital in order to achieve its desired outcome. However, I called this one a stinker for a reason. This is not a great DA, generally, because the State Department is one of the more siloed departments in the executive branch. It has dedicated offices for different issues. So like, for example, we have a different department for Middle East affairs, particularly in the context of like the Iran DA that was put out last night. Then we do people that are tasked with our NATO mission or our relationship with countries in East Asia. So unless your diplomatic capital DA suggests we're trading off with other Arctic diplomatic priorities, you're going to have a tough time winning that the thing that the DA has identified as the priority for the State Department is where they are pulling resources from in order to do the plan. If the State Department working on Iran and the status quo were to decide we also want to, go mining in Greenland, and we have to explain that to Denmark, we're probably not going to take people away from negotiating with Iran in order to do that, because both of those things are pretty important, and the Iran thing is probably way more important, to be honest. So we would not be pulling people from the thing that we are saying we are doing diplomatically. We'd probably pull people from maybe the NATO diplomatic mission, maybe at very worst, some oceanic thing that could have implications where they might have some expertise. Certainly not pulling away people that are negotiating a nuclear deal with Iran in order to explain to Greenland why we want to steal their resources. Certainly not something that the policymakers in the State Department would consider in the context of diplomatic capital. Also, read the news, Trump doesn't really do diplomacy. Even all the uniqueness articles for the Iran deal are we're really surprised that the United States is trying to do anything with Iran in the status quo. We don't really have a particular goal in mind. We just want a nuclear deal. But we also ripped up the last Iran deal in the first Trump administration. So clearly we're not too keen on a deal that Iran maybe would agree to. And we also generally have pulled back because Trump is a transactionalist and he wants other countries to be doing the legwork on a lot of this stuff. So even in the context of us doing burden sharing negotiations with NATO, that is more of a demand than a negotiation. And NATO countries are the ones responsible for figuring out how burden sharing and how they're going to increase their military spending, the proportion of their GDP that they're spending on defense. is to come about. We would rather, in the status quo, make demands than negotiate. And so it seems like the current iteration of the State Department is much less conducive to the diplomatic capital DA. Also, people don't like us. Like, there's the part of it about diplomatic capital, but like if no one wants to listen to the current administration, we don't have any diplomatic capital to begin with. So, good faith implementation of the plan might be that we can persuade people, but like realistically, in the areas that the DAs are talking about, we don't have a ton of leverage a lot of the time, and your best bet is to be cutting evidence that suggests that U.S. diplomacy in the area of the diplomatic capital DA doesn't work. There are a lot of cards that say that we are going to bungle this Iran thing. There are a lot of cards that say we're going to screw up pretty much every important diplomatic priority in existence. I'll teach you a little bit later on in the lecture how to find and predict the areas where the DipCap DA is going to go before a tournament, but you should generally be cutting cards and doing updates that are just like US diplomacy fails, and allowing that to guide you to where we are allocating our diplomatic resources, which will allow you to then predict where the DipCap DA might go next. That is the DipCap DA. All right, let's talk about the greatest DA in the history of DAs, the Allied Assurance DA. This DA argues that the plan collapses assurances of key US allies. The plan collapses assurance of key US allies. For example, our allies kind of hate it when we cooperate with our enemies, especially when we don't ask them first. Because, they're the ones that have to be next to Russia. NATO countries are next to Russia. They are incredibly fearful of Russia and suspicious of the fact that the United States would want to cooperate with their biggest adversary. Other countries, Japan, Korea, our Asian allies, are incredibly scared of China. They would be incredibly suspicious if we started working with China in a key geopolitical arena rather than trying to assert our leadership, just kind of ceding the Arctic to them and being cooperative over it. Our allies tend to like the fact that the United States constantly tries to compete internationally. And so if we were to suddenly say, we don't want to compete for the resources in the Arctic anymore, we just want to kind of let China and Russia have them, or negotiate so that we get like an even third, like nice clean split. Our allies don't want a clean split. They want us to have them all, because then they're cheaper for our allies. They're more expensive for our adversaries. They weaken our adversaries' bargaining power over non-US allies. Our allies really hate it when we cooperate with other countries, non-allied countries. There are some different impacts that this can get us to. Nuclear proliferation is the most common one. That impact suggests that if allies are unsure about the United States' commitment to their security, they will develop their own nuclear arsenals to attempt to provide themselves with the reassurance that they can survive an attack by an adversary. The primary reason that most people are aligned with the United States, particularly in Europe and in Asia, is because they are what are called nuclear umbrella states, or nuclear patrons of the United States. An attack on one is an attack on all, is the principle of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and the bedrock of all US alliances. If allies are unsure that we're going to defend them, if we're getting cozy with their adversaries, they need that nuclear shield, because it is the most destructive and consequential force that you can have, and the strongest deterrent that you can have. Or at least they believe that it is, and that's all that really matters for the DA. The reason they believe that it is the reason that they have a treaty alliance with the United States and continue to try to win over the United States, even when we have administrations that are openly or, silently hostile towards those allies. Could also get to regional deterrence. If the United States is working less with its allies and cozying up to its adversaries, our allies may be sort of less keen on doing things like military exercises. Our adversaries also will know that our allies and us are fighting. They may take that opportunity to get some limited gains in the context of our alliances. So an example of this would be if the United States were to start working more with Russia, Russia could be incentivized to, put some more missiles in Belarus to try to freak Poland out, to try to bring Poland closer to their orbit. They could move some stuff over to Kaliningrad. That'd be even more threatening to the eastern flank of NATO, because that's right on the border of the Baltic states and of Poland. Those are what are called frontline states, the countries in important theaters of competition that are closest to the primary adversary. So in the context of Europe, that is often referring to Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and Poland, because those are the countries that Russia would have to go through to get to the rest of Europe. In the context of the Middle East, that is usually referred to as Israel, though that has fewer implications now that Israel is actively embroiled in a war. So there aren't as many cards now describing the importance of the US alliance with Israel, now that everybody is sort of cozying up to the idea that Israel is not so good as an ally. It's also often referring to Taiwan, because Taiwan is the gateway that China could use to then claim a bunch of other islands in the South and East China Sea. And so Taiwan is considered an Asian frontline state that would be important for China in trying to project its power across the Pacific Ocean. Japan, to a lesser extent also, because Japan is where China could gain access to important US Air Force bases in some of our territories. So like in Guam and the Mariana Islands, China could use sort of southern Japan in order to access those installations more easily. So Japan sometimes can be considered a frontline state. South Korea also, because North Korea is there, but like they're not really an adversary. They're kind of secondary. They're like an annoying little brother. So you don't often see North Korea referenced as a frontline state, but sometimes. There's also hedging. Hedging is the idea that when allies are uncertain about the United States' commitment, they will start to maybe open themselves up to relating more with countries in their periphery. A very commonly cited example of this is South Korea expanding its economic ties with China. So when we have tried to build missile defense installations in South Korea, China has sort of voiced some objections, we can say. South Korea's response to that was to cancel the missile defense installations and to start to work more economically with China to try to pacify them. If countries are unsure that the United States will protect them, they could be incentivized to do things like expand diplomatic ties or economic ties with our adversaries to provide them a fallback option in case the United States decides it no longer wants to be their ally. So if they're fearing that, they need another option to guarantee that our adversaries don't attack them. And so they want to create things like economic and diplomatic interdependence with those countries in order to provide a disincentive for those countries to then exploit the lack of a US alliance. And so that is a common response that countries have, and one that has significant implications for our ability to use our allies to project power and maintain our leadership. So you can use hedging to often get to just like a straight up hegemony impact. Similar but different words that get to sort of the same place. So if you're trying to cooperate with Russia, you need good answers to this DA. Particularly after Russia invaded Ukraine, there are a lot of cards that are like, our allies, their number one issue right now, even in Asia, is Russia. Russia is perceived as the largest threat to international stability, the one most capable of throwing the globe off balance. Our allies are really scared of Russia across the globe. Even in Asia, Japan has contested territory with Russia called the Kuril Islands. South Korea knows that Russia is the primary supplier for North Korean goods and services. They provide a lot of military support to North Korea. They help them build their nuclear arsenal, and all of their nuclear weapons are based on Soviet technology. All of the cars that North Koreans drive come from Russia. Russia is the primary sanctions evader in the context of North Korea. So even the allies that feel like they have a significant amount of distance from Russia are significantly impacted by Russian cooperation with the United States and perceived United States warming up to Russia. So some answers that the AF could say in response is that allies like Russia and China, they think that if the United States is working with them, it makes it less likely that they're going to go to war. This is, I would refer to this as aspirational. Really, our allies are not that keen on the United States, States' ability to bargain with our adversaries, particularly now where we've shown sort of incompetence at containing Chinese growth and expansion and Russian aggression in Europe, our allies really do not believe that we have it in us to pacify other countries. The plan is not perceived, so for our smaller affirmatives, you can gaslight the judge a little bit, even if you read that big relations advantage into thinking the plan is small enough. There's this like card from 2016 that people are reading against the NATO DA that's like the plan is soft security, not perceived as appeasement. That could have implications for the Allies DA if the plan is not perceived as totally warming up to our adversaries, but just a measure to stop a war. Maybe our allies could be reasonable and understand our perspective on that. The big one is assurance collapse is inevitable in the status quo. In NATO, that is pivoted in the context of Trump demanding that European nations spend more on their defense. So last week, for example, France and the UK reaffirmed an old commitment that they haven't talked about in a long time. They said, it is hard to envision that an attack on France would not be an attack on Britain, and vice versa. For the first time in the history of France, France is now committing to military exercises with a NATO member state that would have implications in a nuclear crisis. France, for a long time, has had something called the frappe de force, which is the idea that its nuclear arsenal is independent from all of the other nuclear arsenals in NATO. That France retains exclusive sovereignty over its nuclear arsenal. The fact that France, a country that has refused to participate in NATO's nuclear planning group since its inception, a country that has refused to say it would ever use a nuclear weapon if Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty were activated, is now choosing to do military exercises and intelligence sharing for the purposes of, well, with dual use assets, with assets that could be conventional or could be nuclear, is unprecedented and a response to the perceived weakening of US commitment to the European alliance. Because they are no longer sure that the United States is going to come to Europe's defense if Russia were to invade Estonia tomorrow. They need to develop a stronger continental deterrent that does not rely on an unreliable United States. This is both an example of hedging, not in the sense of our moving closer to an adversary, but moving closer to each other. It is also a persuasive and visual indicator that U.S. assurance to NATO is weakening and causing our allies to change their behavior. In the context of Japan and Korea, it's a bit less clear. Because those alliances tend to be a bit more secretive and public displays of diplomacy in the context of the Trump administration don't happen nearly as often as they do with NATO, especially given the war in Ukraine, it's a bit less clear where those alliances stand. Trump's transactionalism in his first term resulted in a prolonged dispute over how much South Korea was going to pay us in order to station troops in their territory. That dispute has yet to come up, but could come up soon when we have to renegotiate that agreement. It also seems like Japan and South Korea both have been impacted somewhat by the trade war, and that could have significant implications on their willingness to contribute to the U.S. alliance and their belief in our willingness to uphold our end of that bargain. And so those cards are a bit fewer and far between, but they certainly exist, and they are certainly written very persuasively. So there are some key allies that you need to be aware of in writing pro-lift defense, link defense, and potentially hedging defense against. So NATO and its constitutive parts. So that includes Germany, who has recently, for the first time in a long time, suggested that it would be open to expanding its nuclear capacity. And so there's a lot of evidence written in the past year or two that suggests that now is an important time for German nuclearization. Eastern Europe, those are the frontline states, also referred to as the CEE states, Central and Eastern Europe. That would include Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Slovakia, Czechia, any NATO country that is considered part of Eastern Europe. So like Central and Eastern Europe. If a lot of people get mad when you call the Czech Republic Eastern Europe, so Central and Eastern Europe. So then anything east of Germany. France and the UK as well. We station nuclear weapons in the UK. They also have their own arsenal. We station nuclear weapons also in like Netherlands, Belgium, Italy, Turkey, but I think France and the UK are the ones that are showing more visible signs right now of potentially being willing to question the United States' commitment to them. So those are just some of the key allies you should be aware of. Japan and South Korea, a lot of cards about them getting their own nuclear weapons, a lot of cards about how they see Trump. Philippines, to a lesser extent, really just for that like kind of China area. Taiwan as well for the same reason. So these are all countries where there are lots of cards about the US alliance, potentially cards about the Arctic, especially in the context of NATO, Japan, and South Korea, and lots of cards about Russia. All right. Appeasement and strategic stability. We're kind of familiar with these already. I'm sure we've had lots of practice debates on them, so I'm going to be a bit brief. Appeasement says the signal of the plan is exploited by our adversaries who demand concessions in other areas. So Russia could continue to demand territorial concessions in a peace deal in Ukraine. China could continue to test our alliances to see if we're willing to back down in other places. It's best against cooperatives AFs with military implications that constrain the ability of the United States military to compete either through diplomacy or through a peace deal. AFs will usually say the plan is not a big enough signal and that it pacifies our adversaries because they're defensive realists. They'll read some nice Russian propaganda to suggest that Russia's not evil. The China cards are a bit better, but like usually the Russia cards are kind of meh. They'll say that. Strategic stability suggests that the plan makes the US too threatening to its adversaries, which pressures them to erroneously launch a nuclear weapon. This is what the first demo debate centered on, if you remember, and has been a core controversy so far with a lot of the AFs put out at camp. This relies on the security dilemma, which I believe has been introduced to you in a lot of the IR lectures so far. And the weaker the US adversary, the stronger the link, because the more likely they are to feel backed into a corner by increased US military strength. This is best against AFs that aim for US military dominance in a particular domain, rather than parity or mutual vulnerability with our adversaries. And it is best served if you're AF by arguing that the US needs to be dominant rather than just equal to our adversaries, because we're obviously never going to be the one to launch a nuke, and so we need to be able to totally dominate our adversaries to convince them that they're going to lose a war if they try to start one, rather than suggesting that we have like a second strike, which is mutually assured destruction. All right, appeasement and strategic stability. Next, leadership disadvantages. The plan reasserts US leadership in the Arctic, which trades off with somebody else's ability to lead. Could have to do with soft power, like the starter packet China DA did, the ability to persuade through attraction, or hard power, the ability to coerce using forceful means. So it gets to a couple different impacts. International leadership could be important for domestic reasons. I think this is kind of weak. But like this was the impact to the China soft power DA. I don't think the cards are very good. Maybe the country that we're trading off with has a unique role to play in solving some important problem. So maybe Norway is like really good at using icebreakers or something. Or maybe like Danish soft power is really important because they've got like Svalbard or something. I don't know. Or that country will lash out militarily if it cannot use soft power to get what it wants. Coercive measures are the replacement for diplomacy. So if we interfere with China's ability to do its diplomatic bargaining with smaller countries, they're likely to do things like militarily pressure those countries instead if we impede their ability to lead diplomatically. There are a couple potential avenues this can go. Middle powers, Canada, Norway, Finland are some of the Arctic middle powers directly. These are countries that possess certain and special capabilities that grant them a voice in global affairs, but are not major powers that have a voice on everything. China, who could lash out if the US undermines its role in the Arctic, increase its militarization of the Arctic, particularly with all of these AFs that claim that you pull China and Russia apart. What do you think China's going to do instead? They're certainly not just going to give up. They'll probably continue to militarize the Arctic to a larger scale than they are on the status quo. AF teams will be best served by going for uniqueness overwhelms the link, that the United States is not going to maintain its soft power post plan because we really are bad at that right now. A lot of good evidence that suggests that. That is the soft power DA that I think a lot of you are already familiar with. All right. You've got your international politics DAs, your Putin DAs, your Xi Disads. First, there's the regime good Disad that says that the plan is a loss for the regime that it cooperates with. So Putin cannot afford to cave to the West with his pressure on his regime from the Ukraine war and its economic effects. So caving to the West makes him look weak, empowers secessionists, makes him divert to another war somehow. Or for China, she just can't look weak to its populace, and doing so means that he has to cause a diversionary war. The impact is usually diversionary war, or that the public will overthrow the regime. The first one, more plausible than the second a lot of the time, particularly for countries as big as China and Russia. The AF is best off suggesting that other issues are more important for public support, or that regimes are resilient. Putin kills his dissidents, does it all the time. He just killed his transportation minister like a week or two ago. Continues to do that all the time. Kills journalists that publish stuff that people don't like. And to a lesser extent, the same is true of China. Regime bad is the opposite, that the plan is a win for a regime that otherwise will see a dip in public support. For Russia, if we legitimize Putin internationally as a deal maker by working with the United States, it will stop his regime from collapsing, and his regime will invade all of Europe. Otherwise, it'd be replaced by like a super nice diplomatic alternative. China, working with the United States, could give Xi a win economically. Otherwise, the CCP will be overthrown by pro-democratic forces and make China into a beacon of democracy around the world. These DAs are worse than the other ones. The impact is usually contrived, but the link is usually tricky to answer. Most people will label it Putin DA or China DA. And if it catches you off guard, you may accidentally answer the wrong DA in the 2AC. So it's important to recognize what the DA says about the regime when you are writing your 2ACs to them. The inability to answer the moving parts of these DAs will get the AF into trouble, even if some of them aren't that good. All right. The AF should go for impact defense and regime resilience arguments against these. Next, we have probably the most persuasive disadvantage, the shunning disadvantage. This argues that it is unethical and immoral to work with regimes committing evil acts. This is a deontological disadvantage. So you Kant heads out there, this is how you can read Kant on this year's topic. Russia is committing active war crimes in Ukraine. It mistreats gender minorities and assassinates its political dissidents. China is persecuting ethnic minorities, suppressing freedom of speech, undermining national sovereignty in Taiwan, Tibet, Hong Kong, and Inner Mongolia. These are all things we shouldn't stand for as the beacon of democracy that we are. We're America. Our job is to maintain moral order in the world. If we can't maintain moral order in the world, what good is hegemony? This DA could be answered by defending consequentialism or utilitarianism or an ism and saying that the AF is better than the status quo. Obviously, incredibly unpersuasive arguments that most judges won't be persuaded by. The shunning DA is overpowered, as you can tell. You usually got to read some cards from like 1989 about sanctions to get the impact calc arguments. Always a great look when your impact cards from 1989. Always a great look. Older than like the overwhelming majority of the lab leaders. Awesome. All right. Some tips and tricks for finding and writing new disadvantages. Most importantly, read the news. I have been rattling off random facts about the news throughout this lecture, and I don't even really read the news that much. I read it a lot more as a debater, but, you know, I'm on X, the Everything app. I follow a lot of pundits. I know about the world. That's how you win a lot of DA debates, is just knowing more about the world than your opponent. And the way you do that is reading the news. The best DAs are specific to the moment. They are DAs that show a knowledge of world affairs and develop nuance through that. So you could have your basic German pro-lift DA insert generic evidence about Russia co-op, or you could be crafting a creative story about some important diplomatic event, like that declaration between France and the UK, if you're writing your NATO DA. Crafting your DA to be specific to the moment, specific to that declaration, because it allows you to have a monopoly on specificity and to circumvent the 2AC's most persuasive arguments. You can use Google News to do this. Set up alerts for key phrases and research terms so that you get an email every morning or every time a new article is published. For those of you that know how to use Gmail filters, you can create a filter in your email that sends them to your archive, but then puts them in a folder so that you always have those there. You can sign up for newsletters. Some helpful weekly or daily newsletters include the Arctic Institute, who does a weekly rundown. The U.S. Arctic Research Commission does a daily newsletter that can tell you about important congressional legislation that touches on the Arctic, important new executive initiatives that relate to the Arctic, and what the Arctic Research Council is exploring, which can provide you avenues for new negative arguments and what proposals may be coming up soon. Anchorage Daily News has a daily newsletter that you can select like specific areas of the news. So if you want to know about Alaskan energy policy, you can sign up for local newspapers within Alaska and sign up for their specific local politics newspapers to understand more about that. But any news publication, most of them have a newsletter you can sign up for, either daily, weekly, or sometimes monthly. Follow key topic authors on social media, on X the Everything app. They tend to repeat articles of interest. They will comment on various events that can provide you with key search terms or other authors to reach. And they post whenever they publish something new. So if they're publishing outside of where they normally are publishing, then you may not see that unless you follow that author. And so using social media for good and not just for doom scrolling can help you win debates. If your news authors are on TikTok, I guess. I don't know. Do updates for every tournament. You should never be reading the same uniqueness card for your DA that you read the tournament before. There is enough news being published in the 24-hour news cycle that you can find new cards for every DA, week to week, almost guaranteed. If you are reading a uniqueness card from September and it is December, you look like a loser who hasn't cut new evidence since Greenhill. You don't want to look like a loser, do you? You want to look smart. Cut uniqueness evidence. Some evidence you should always cut before a tournament, the week before the tournament. Econ high, econ low. The economy comes up often enough that it's good to have one or two cards. Key legislation. So, Punchbowl News is a fantastic newsletter that will tell you what is important in Congress in a coming week. Politico has their own newsletter. The Hill has special alerts and a variety of newsletters. All of these are important ways to understand what politics DAs could be read. Politics DA Mechanics, having a search term set up for Trump political capital, for Trump's popularity, as well as generic DA uniqueness. Alliances, if you're AF, links to those. Your neg DAs, so mining now, no mining now, cards about potential thumpers that people have been reading at past tournaments. All of this stuff is part of basic tournament preparation. Some of you may be thinking, I thought that we just get all of the cards we're going to read through the year at camp. Wrong. You got to produce your own evidence to be a successful debater, and those are some of the places that you need to be focusing if you want to successfully go for disadvantages on the topic. The process of doing updates will help reveal new versions of old DAs, as well as new areas for further research. So if you are looking at the Arctic Institute weekly newsletter every week, and you see with increasing frequency that some issue is coming up, you know that if you're not writing a DA about that, somebody else is going to. So you at the very least know what you need to have AF answers to. The best 2As predict the most persuasive arguments against their affirmatives and write responses before they are even read. And being well-informed about the affirmative and well-informed about global affairs is an important way of making those types of predictions. Just because you're not cutting the DA doesn't mean someone else isn't, and so you need to have AF answers even if you don't cut every DA you think of. The other thing you can do is become a prolific wiki troll. Use past topics to guide your research. You should familiarize yourself with common arguments read on any applicable topics, high school and college. So you could tell in Raleigh's lecture that he pulled a lot of counterpoint examples from the oceans topic because it used similar wording, had similar advantage areas. The wiki is archived through 2012. 2012-13 is the first season of the college wiki, and I think of the high school wiki as well. So you can see how those topics evolved, not just what people read at the start, but how AFs changed, how those topics evolved, and how the DAs evolved. So for college, your international DAs, the space topic in 2020, the nukes topic in 23-24, and the alliances topic in 2021. Those can provide you with some avenues for international DAs. The energy topic last year is where a lot of those energy DAs, your oil, your LNG, your electricity prices, your grid DAs, all of those will have new and updated evidence from that college energy topic that we just had. In high school, NATO and arms sales could both be your international DAs. Arms sales was 2019 to 2020. NATO was 2 years ago. Fiscal redistribution could have some of your econ stuff, though not a ton of it. And oceans for your domestic DAs, your trade-off DAs, your NOAA trade-off DA, your sort of other more domestic oceanic stuff. 2 is that you need to innovate on these ideas. Obviously, if you're pulling open evidence files from 2014, your DA is gonna suck. It's not gonna be very good. But you can use it to find some key search terms. This will create new avenues for future research. You can see common words that those cards, even the older ones, are using. You can find those articles. If they're scholarly, you can use Cited By on Google Scholar to find newer articles writing about similar phenomena that are building on the ideas introduced by those articles. It will allow you to see how teams responded to the position. So if you're looking for AF answers to a DA that you know came from the college topic, you can go to those AF wikis and see how the peak final form of the 2AC to the econ DA evolved and use that to guide your research. Not steal the cards, use them to guide your research, because specificity is going to be key. And I keep seeing articles with carbon tax in the name in the generics for these things. You shouldn't be reading the cards about the carbon tax, but you can use it to find key econ terms that could apply to the AF. That is the end of the slideshow. We got about 3 minutes if there are any questions. If not, you're free to go.